Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from Waffles. I'm talking about the 2007 album from Pantha du Prince, This Bliss. Okay, here we got a pretty interesting request. Pantha du Prince is a German minimal techno artist, real name Hendrik Weber. He's been at it since the mid-2000s and is still going to this day. I believe he released his 6th album under this name just last year. I haven't heard any of his other projects as of right now, though I have heard good things about Diamond Days and Black Noise. This particular album, though, his second, is kind of in a weird spot because legally it's not available to listen to on any streaming service or purchasable from any store aside from buying secondhand copies from its original pressing back in 2007. See, there's one track from this album called Saturn Strobe, which liberally samples a string orchestra composition from Howard Skempton. But the sample was never cleared. Weber was sued, and his label was forced to stop all distribution of the album on all formats. Not just forced to remove that one song with uncleared sample, the entire album had to come down and never be sold again, despite none of the other songs on here containing any samples. That is pretty nuts. I will have to link an unofficial YouTube re-upload of the album in the description, as it's the only way I know of to stream the project in full. It's a real shame though, since this album got lots of rave reviews at the time of its release. The requester pitched it to me mentioning that a lot of people consider it one of the best minimal techno albums of all time. And after hearing it myself, I also thought this project was pretty damn great right away. It is a very straightforward minimal techno release if you're not down for projects like these, mostly consisting of fairly simplistic compositions that mostly repeat the same stuff over 7+ minutes. It's probably not going to be your thing. And it does also tend to work more as background music for me than anything else. But damn, for what this genre can deliver, I was pulled into this pretty immediately and consistently kept invested even over the course of 74 minutes. If you are into this particular style, it is absolutely worth seeking out in spite of its current lack of availability. Right from the get-go, the album opener Asha lets you know exactly what to expect in terms of the tone and overall style of the album. Very simple and standard low-key techno beats that still form a pretty tight and danceable groove. Some warm, plinking, mid-range melodic synth progressions, and a few rhythmic clanging bell textures for good measure. As stripped back and simple as it is, it conveys a nicely welcoming and comforting atmosphere and has just enough build-up and payoff with very minor change over time that keeps the whole composition investing, and it sets up the formula that pretty much everything else on the album follows to some degree. Now, the actual track Saturn Strobe, the one with the uncleared sample, it is a bit of an outlier in the track listing by the way it sounds, but it's a real shame this one got him in so much trouble because it's probably just straight up the best cut on here. I mean, I do get why the dispute came in. The entire track is built around that pad of orchestral strings, with his fairly minimal beats and occasional synth blip melodies layered on top. The sample does a lot of the work in getting the track to work as well as it does. It just creates this perfect melancholy tone that adds this level of deeper emotional resonance that nothing else on this project quite lives up to. But the micro house beats that Weber added also give the entire track more momentum and groove that you obviously wouldn't get out of just listening to the original composition and make it feel perfectly at home on this particular album. Also recontextualizing this string composition, which feels like it could soundtrack a funeral scene in a movie, into something that has much more of a, I guess, a hopeful edge to it, that feels like it evokes the wide expanses of space or something. I do think it justifies being his own track despite how much it relies on that sample. It's an absolutely fantastic track, and even if, again, it is a bit of a one-off in terms of the sound of the full album, the project would definitely be negatively impacted if you cut it out entirely. With that said, the album would still be pretty damn good even if you did cut it out. The rest of the album tends to follow a lot of the same formulas mostly set up by the opener, but there's just enough variety to keep things interesting, and the minimal techno grooves are consistently super tight and do most of the work for keeping the entire experience investing. Walden 2, for instance, goes on for over 10 minutes with some generally darker sounding 3-note synth progressions. But its brooding atmosphere is pretty dang cool, and that's all before the halfway mark where there's a nice 2-3 minute change up into some happier sounding bass lines and chords that also get later reworked to fit with the core minor key melody. it's really freaking good. And it's not the only 10 plus minute track here that well justified its length like that. The other one is Urlichten, which goes a little over 12 minutes. It's structured kind of similarly. I suppose the core bass lines have more of a jumpier and more playful bend to them, but there's also multiple side tracks into all these clanging and chiming noises that sound really cool, different melodies and patterns that get introduced past the first 5 minutes and get more focused on, and then there's that whole outro where all the melodies just kind of slowly disintegrate into a pile of low-key bubbly synth plucks at the end. Again, it definitely does well to justify that more extended length. There's also a bunch of cuts here that do go for a more melody-centric approach that ends up with maybe a bit more texture and emotional resonance than the average for this album. See all the echoing and plinking melodies throughout Eisbaden, or the more heartfelt touches of the final two cuts, Steiner im Flug and Seeds of Sleep. I really like the Glockenspiel-esque melodic textures of the former, and the way the latter slowly evolves from these airy piano-like sounds into some other mixes that resemble the opener and feel like they're bringing the album around full circle. Now, there were admittedly a few cuts here and there that didn't pull me in as effectively. Whiteout and Moonstruck come to mind, as they have among the most stripped-back approaches and repetitive structures. But even these two tracks are pretty dang solid. Whiteout's growling one-note bass line does create a bit of a menacing effect I think is pretty cool, and Moonstruck's lead melodies, despite maybe a lack of development, are among the catchiest in the bunch and did grow on me quite a bit the more I listened to this thing. I guess Florak also didn't really stick out as a major standout to me, but its progressions of like droning guitar-like synth pads that especially get focused on in its second half are pretty dang cool and give that track an identity to call its own. I really don't have much to complain about here from an individual track basis. Despite how long it runs on, there's nothing I'd want to skip. Now, I will say that despite how immediately I did get into this album, it's not like gonna rank among my favorites of all time or anything. With how stripped back and simplistic all these compositions are, it did create an experience that typically fell into the background and ran together for me. And while there's no tracks I'd want to outright skip, the whole thing does run on maybe a tad long. There are a few cuts which are a bit on the filler-ish side, and it didn't leave me strongly itching to put it on again after I was done. I wouldn't say this project is anything life-changing, and Saturn's Strobe was the only one on here I thought was flat-out excellent, but everything else here ranges from really good to great. I cannot deny how fantastically well-crafted all of these grooves are and how well they pulled in my attention, even through this album's least interesting moments. And something really needs to be said for how immediate a listen this was as well. The guy who requested this gave me a list of like 5 possible albums to fulfill his request, which I only briefly previewed through. But even when I'd only heard like 4 or 5 seconds of every track on here, I was already like, this sounds like I could really get into it. And the album lived up to my expectations for it. I would understand if some people came up to this album and found it to be like boring or pretentious or something like that. I don't think it's gonna be for everyone. But if you do have a taste for this particular brand of minimal techno, this is something special. It's got the variety, the emotional resonance, and the pacing to make for a listening experience that could grab me instantly. I can definitely see myself hanging on to it. I would definitely recommend you give it a shot too. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to edge yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.